people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Okay, we'll start with this. Australian veteran fighter Shotgun Shannon OConnell posted this via her social media, and it reads, "To me, there's no better accomplishment in life than doing the impossible, overcoming adversity to get there and showing everyone out there what's possible. This comeback is really like someone's business bouncing back from bankruptcy. My injury should have been career-ending. We all know that's not how I roll, though, and I know that the best is yet to come for me. I'm super excited to finally be debuting as a No Limit Promotions fighter on a great Brisbane-based show. Massive thank you to Glenn for making this happen, Matt Rose for locking in an opponent after weeks of trying, and to Sarah for accepting this fight. I'm also really excited to be representing my new team at the boxing shop under Gareth in Shara." That's right.
I wasn't aware she was injured.
It's been 6 months since news formally broke that Shotgun Shannon OConnell had entered into a promotional deal with No Limit Promotions, a well-to-do promoter in Australia that promotes Tim Tszyu, his younger brother Nikita Tszyu, several other fighters,
several other shows.
And it was 6 months ago in November of last year when news formally broke that Shotgun Shannon OConnell, who's been having a hell of a run, she entered into a promotional deal with them. But since then, news went kind of quiet, and it appears that the reason Shotgun Shannon OConnell hasn't returned to action sooner was because she was recuperating from an injury. But she's set to make her No Limit Promotions debut this month
against a familiar face,
when we saw not that long ago in action against Taylor Robertson. Sarah Higginson is going to be taking on Shotgun Shannon OConnell in what is Shannon's No Limit debut.
That's the same Sarah Higginson that Taylor Robertson fought on the undercard of Kambosos versus Haney.
She's supposed to be taking on veteran fighter Shannon OConnell, who I think will prove to be too much for Sarah. Sarah is nowhere near as experienced. If she thought she had her hands full with Taylor Robertson, I can only imagine what Shannon's going to do to her.
Less than ideal for Sarah Higginson, but more than ideal for Shannon OConnell.
Shannon needs a fight to help her ease back into activity, an easy one of sorts, a winnable one.
Sarah Higginson is nowhere near as experienced as Shannon.
Doesn't come from a deep amateur background or anything of the sort. She's a late starter in the sport. She's a come-forward scrapper, and she's not better at it than Shotgun Shannon OConnell. There's a reason Shannon has wins over what were then unbeaten fighters like Shernika Johnson, who now reigns as the IBF's super bantamweight champion, and Taylor Robertson, who very recently beat Sarah Higginson. There's a reason.
Shannon beat them both, and she's going to beat Sarah next. That's how I see it.
And what will be her first fight as a No Limit Promotions fighter. This fight is set to go down in Brisbane at the end of this month on the 29th.
On the undercard of Wilson versus Rueda.
At minimum, I think Shannon can win a points decision. At most, I think she can stop her. I think she can stop Sarah Higginson, and I wouldn't be surprised if she does. What she does beyond that, your guess is as good as mine. Shannon OConnell is due a title shot, not just by way of the WBA at bantamweight, but also by way of the IBF. And I've heard of no such ordering either Jamie Mitchell or Ebony Bridges to satisfy her as a mandatory. So what happens after the Higginson fight? We'll just have to wait and see.
Just in keeping with the theme of all things Australia,
we now know who it is Taylor Robertson is going to be fighting on the undercard of Breidis versus Jo Pattaya.
La boxeadora venezolana Jocelyn Fernandez busca título mundial juvenil en Australia.
July 2nd, Venezuelan up-and-comer Jocelyn Fernandez is going to be taking on Taylor Robertson for what is an IBF youth title.
You know, I speculated that whoever Taylor ends up fighting next, it'll likely be someone more interesting.
Because it's for a youth title, it might be someone more interesting, perhaps more capable than Sarah Higginson was. Sarah Higginson, ahead of that Robertson fight, she only had 3 pro contests, 3 pro bouts, whereas Jocelyn Fernandez,
she's younger than Sarah Higginson, and she has more professional bouts.
She's got more pro bouts than either Sarah Higginson or Taylor Robertson, who beat her. So I was right to assume that Taylor's next opponent, at minimum, would be a solid or semi-solid fighter.
Jocelyn Fernandez is 23 years old, sporting a professional record of 11 wins, 1 loss with no draws, 5 knockouts.
Whereas Taylor Robertson, she's a year older than Jocelyn, sporting a professional record of 5 wins with 1 loss, no draws.
Only 1 knockout, just 1 knockout.
Jocelyn's lone defeat came at the hands of her countrywoman, Venezuelan journeywoman, Deborah Rengifo, who stopped Jocelyn Fernandez 2 fights ago.
8th round TKO stoppage.
That was last year, in November. Coincidentally, Taylor Robertson suffered her first professional loss last year as well at the hands of Shannon OConnell, who we just talked about. But Taylor didn't get stopped like Jocelyn Fernandez got stopped. No, Taylor got outworked and lost a decision.
The fact that Jocelyn Fernandez was stopped by Deborah Rengifo speaks to the level at which she competes.
Where she is right now, because Deborah Rengifo very much is a journeywoman level opponent, having been stopped 4 times throughout the course of her career, having lost 9 fights overall, losing to Evelyn Bermudez, who ragdolled her in her last fight, having lost fights to Jo Pattaya and Yesenia Gomez.
The list goes on.
The fact that Jocelyn Fernandez couldn't make it past this kind of fighter, this kind of opponent, the fact that a 22-year-old Jocelyn Fernandez couldn't make it past Deborah Rengifo, well, I think that speaks volumes about where she is right now as a fighter. And if you take a look at her professional record, while she has a lot of professional fights and she's fought in 10-rounders,
At least once.
the vast majority of those girls that Jocelyn fought have upside-down records. Some have losses in double digits. At least one was making her professional debut.
And yeah, she's got a lot of professional fights, but not against very good
I
fighters.
don't say that to be critical. I say that to be honest. These are not the kind of fighters you can derive very much from. Not when you're fighting this high abundance of them. I think that Jocelyn Fernandez, having stepped up in competition with Deborah Rengifo and having been stopped, that kind of tells you what you need to know.
But I'm going with Taylor Robertson to win.
Perhaps by way of knockout, she seems a more authoritative puncher at super flyweight, where she is now campaigning, as opposed to how she seemed up there at bantamweight. She might pack a bigger punch.
At least big enough to stop Jocelyn Fernandez.
For Taylor Robertson, it's a semi-solid scalp and a semi-solid fighter, because Taylor doesn't even have 10 pro fights.
Overall, I like the matchmaking. They matched her against unbeaten Sarah Higginson.
Now they're matching her against Jocelyn Fernandez, who has more pro fights than Taylor, albeit against
Lackluster competition.
Look for Robertson versus Fernandez on the undercard of Breidis versus Jo Pattaya early next month on the 2nd. In other news, in addition to that story and that Breidis versus Jo Pattaya fight set to go down early next month, this past weekend, unbeaten UK cruiserweight Richard Riakporhe,
He was in action. He stopped Fabio Turchi in 2 rounds.
he got to calling people out. And Cale Sorland was paying attention as he took to social media and stated, "Congratulations, Richard Riakporhe." So this was an eliminator for the division's number 1, Breidis. We don't need to wait. Take care of business down under on July 2nd in our mandatory, and then it's game on.
Wait a minute, so they don't plan on unifying with Lawrence Okolie afterward?
Cale Sorland added, "Richard Riakporhe, boxer and Sky Sports Boxing, are you for real? Or is it a PR stunt with the eliminator? Nowhere to run, and certainly no place to hide from 3-time world champion, Ring Magazine champion, and World Boxing Super Series winner, Breidis."
He's showing more enthusiasm for a Richard Riakporhe fight than what he's been showing for a Lawrence Okolie unification match.
Bear in mind, he was actually at Lawrence Okolie's last fight, disguised as Super Mario of the Super Mario Brothers. A Twitter user that goes by the name Maxwell Jones stated, "It's actually embarrassing how bad Breidis is ducking Okolie, and you're actually fine with it." To which Cale Sorland replied, "He's got a mandatory on July 2nd.
Yeah, but you're talking about fighting Richard Riakporhe after that fight.
The cruiserweight division here today stands divided. And it's been divided now for a little while. You know, you got Lunga Makabu holding the WBC, Breidis holding the IBF, the very inactive Arsene Goulamarian of La France holding the WBA. That guy hasn't had a fight since 2019. And you have Lawrence Okolie holding the WBO. And there was a time when people were expecting Lawrence Okolie and Breidis to unify titles with each other, it being that they both fight under well-to-do banners, under well-to-do promotional outfits with some means and some financial muscle. But as it stands, that hasn't happened yet, and it doesn't look like it's going to. Not based on what Kel Sorland is saying. Kel Sorland of the Sorland Brothers, Sorland Promotions.
Which is not Wasserman.
You get the gist of it. They promote Maris Breidis, and there was a time when Kel Sorland himself was calling for that Lawrence Okolie unification match. But a lot has happened since then. Rather, a lot hasn't happened. Maris Breidis has taken a liking to cutting records and calling out YouTuber turned pugilist Jake Paul. He seems to have more energy for that than a unification match with Lawrence Okolie, this division's WBO champion.
It goes without saying that Maris Breidis has spent more time calling out Jake Paul than he spent calling out Lawrence Okolie.
Made a complete ass out of himself doing it. He was actually at Lawrence Okolie's last fight, his title defense against Poland's own Mikhail Cieslak, dressed in a Super Mario costume.
Lawrence Okolie didn't seem amused by it.
And you see what Maris Breidis' promoter is saying now. You see what direction he wants to go. He's talking about a Richard Riakporhe fight after Maris Breidis' upcoming defense of his IBF title against unbeaten Jo Pattaya. What he's not talking about is unifying titles. What he's not talking about is fighting Lawrence Okolie.
Him and his promoter seem to have a lot of energy for a lot of people, but Lawrence Okolie ain't one of them.
I won't lie to you. That's an interesting sequence of fights for Maris Breidis, it is. Unbeaten southpaw Jo Pattaya in Australia early next month in July on the 2nd, then potentially unbeaten Richard Riakporhe over there in the UK by way of Sky Sports and Boxer. It's an interesting sequence of fights that I'd tune into.
Those are good fights, don't get me wrong.
Especially now that Maris Breidis, this division's number one guy, the most accomplished champion of the 4 active reigning world champions at cruiserweight. Those are both very interesting fights because those are young, unbeaten up-and-comers, younger at least than Maris Breidis, who is an aging fighter, an aging champion. His lone defeat came at the hands of Alexander Usyk in a very competitive fight, and there's no shame in that. But there's also no telling if he's still the same guy now that he was way back when he fought Usyk.
Not dressing up like Super Mario, calling out Jake Paul and making an ass out of himself.
I'm just giving it to you straight. It's the only way I know how to give it to you. And while that is a very interesting sequence of fights, from unbeaten Jo Pattaya to unbeaten Richard Riakporhe, it's an interesting sequence of fights.
But it also reads like an effort to put distance between Maris Breidis and Lawrence Okolie.
Maris Breidis is this division's number one guy. You'll get no arguments from me. But when I see this, when I see that Kel Sorland's talking about a Richard Riakporhe fight after the Jo Pattaya mandated title defense, that's what he's talking about. What he's not talking about is a unification match with Lawrence Okolie. When I see this, I tell myself that I don't think Maris Breidis fancies that fight.
Jo Pattaya and Richard Riakporhe make for very interesting fights, but those are also greener guys than Lawrence Okolie.
Those are prospects crossing over into contender status, whereas Lawrence Okolie is an established world-class fighter, a world champion. I mean, that is the difference.
Maybe Kel Sorland figures he can get the same or comparable money to fight Richard Riakporhe on Sky.
Maybe that's what he figures, that for matching Maris Breidis against Lawrence Okolie over there on Matchroom and DAZN, what he can do is get comparable money to fight a greener fighter.
I'm not saying Richard Riakporhe is a walkover.
Not saying that. I'm making an objective statement. Lawrence Okolie is a more experienced professional and a world champion, whereas Richard is not. Richard is greener than Lawrence.
And because he's greener, maybe Kel Sorland likes that fight better.
Everybody knows that Sky Sports and Boxer are in the market for content. They're in the market for fighters. They're doing shows of their own. Now that they're not in bed with Matchroom and Eddie Hearn anymore, they're willing to pay to play. And maybe what Kel Sorland figures is, why take a chance on a Lawrence Okolie for X amount of dollars when you can make comparable money on Sky Sports and Boxer?
Fighting a greener, less experienced fighter.
You see what Joseph Parker did? He bailed on Joyce in a fight that he was supposed to have so that he could enter a long-term deal with people over there at Sky Sports and Boxer. And maybe Kel Sorland has a similar school of thought.
Would it be better if Jo Pattaya ended up taking the red belt away from Maris Breidis early next month?
Jo Pattaya, who was last in action in December of last year, and that way he has seen action in the last 12 months, an unbeaten southpaw with snappy shots, some quickness, some athleticism. Would the cruiserweight division be better off with Jo Pattaya being its reigning IBF champion as opposed to the aging Breidis?
Doesn't seem interested in consolidating titles. He doesn't seem interested in unifying.
So would it be better if Jo Pattaya unseated Breidis early next month? Would that be better for the weight class? Should we root for him? I'll tell you what I think. If Breidis ends up beating Jo Pattaya, successfully defending the red belt, I could very much see Ben Shalom and Adam Smith making him an incentivized offer to defend his title against Richard Riakporhe.
They need champions.
I don't necessarily know if that is a fight that Richard Riakporhe is ready for. I don't know if that's a fight that he wins, but what I do know is that Sky Sports is in the market for fighters, they're in the market for champions, they're in the market for content. Anthony Joshua has gone all in with DAZN, you understand. You know they were holding out hope that he would continue his relationship with them over there at Sky Sports.
Right now, the biggest names in UK boxing, most of them box under the Matchroom banner on the DAZN platform.
Right now they do. But Sky Sports and Boxer are playing the long game. They know that the audience isn't familiar with all of their fighters right now. Not yet. They hope to make them familiar with those fighters. And one way they can do that for a guy like Richard Riakporhe is put an alphabet title in his hands.
I'm not saying he's ready for Breidis. I'm saying I could see Ben Shalom trying to make that fight.
We already know it's a fight that Kale Sorland, who promotes Breidis, we already know it's a fight that he's receptive to. He seems more receptive to that fight than he does unifying titles with Lawrence Okolie. So it's a distinct possibility. What Eddie Hearn has to do now is realize that even if Sky Sports, here and now, doesn't have most of the familiar faces and the familiar fighters, if he's asleep at the wheel,
over time that can change.
the battle for the heart and soul of British boxing has begun. I told you guys months ago.
When all this stuff about Sky Sports and Boxer kicked off their stable of fighters,
And all the different signings they've made since then, the blue chip prospects they've brought on board, like Ben Whitaker,
Olympians like Carolyn Dubois, Karis Artingstall, Lauren Price,
newcomers like Fraser Clark, and that's not everything they've got. They've got familiar faces from Chris Eubank Jr. and Huey Fury and Michael Hunter, Joseph Parker. The list goes on. Very soon, Sky Sports could emerge as Eddie Hearn's biggest competition for the heart and soul of British boxing. And he can't be asleep at the wheel. Not now. The UK market has become that much more competitive because Sky is
still a very big and well-known platform.
Don't underestimate the role of that. Don't underestimate them. You may have all the familiar faces now, but that could change over time. What Eddie Hearn needs to do, he sees they've got a prize stallion in that cruiserweight show. Well, he's got a champion. And what he needs to do for that champion is get him a unification match. Breidis or no Breidis? What about Arsene Goulamarian, who hasn't had a fight since 2019? Make that guy an incentivized offer and get him in the ring.
Cruiserweight has not been a characteristically political division.
Not in the past, but it is now.
Because Sky's got a pony in that show, and so does DAZN.